Olly Lewis. Hi Olly, thank you for coming in.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for giving up your time on rotation, which I know is so precious.
Very excited to be here.
So you are a super yacht captain.
Yes.
But I want to talk a little bit about how you got to where you are today. So can you give me a little bit of a background?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I was coming to the end of my school years and I was just sort of going into the higher education, the A levels. But I wasn't really enjoying myself. I completed the first year, didn't do particularly well. I wasn't working particularly hard. I sat down with my parents and said, listen, I think I want to go to sea. My father, albeit in a different capacity, was also a seafarer. And he sat down with me and said, listen, I think you're too young to go to sea. I don't have anything against it, but just not yet. If you're not enjoying school and you're not doing particularly well, go and get yourself a trade.
How old were you when he said that?
I think I was probably maybe 17, 18,
okay.
Around that. Maybe
so it sounds a sensible thing to do.
Maybe even a little bit younger. But, he was absolutely right. I was far too young. I certainly wasn't mature enough and I still had a lot of growing up to do. So I ended up applying for an apprenticeship in a shipyard called Pendennis down in Falmouth in Cornwall, where I grew up and where I was living at the time. And they were, and I think probably still are, one of the biggest super yacht builders in the UK. And it was tough application. It certainly wasn't a apply and guaranteed to get the apprenticeship. But anyway, I was very fortunate. I was awarded a position and I spent the next 4 years training to be a ship's joiner. And during those 4 years, I was exposed to this weird and wonderful world of super yachts. And, towards the latter end of the apprenticeship, I was thinking, am I going to stay here? Am I going to be a carpenter for the rest of my life? But in the back of my head, the allure of going to sea was still there. And it was still, an itch I had to scratch. The difference being the excitement of going in the Royal Navy or the RFA or the merchant fleet wasn't quite there anymore. And I was attracted to going to sea on a super yacht. And at the time there was a 55 meter yacht that was being built, and I had sort of been there from the conception and from the keel being laid 4 years prior to it being launched 4 years later. And I sort of built up a bit of a rapport with the build crew and certainly the build captain. I think I was probably just a young cheeky apprentice at the time, and he was this grand captain who everybody looked up to. And very brazenly one day I sort of said to him, "Oh, can I come and be a deckhand for you?" And he sort of looked at me and, I was expecting him to shrug me off. And he says, "Okay, come and see me in a couple of days during your lunch break." So I did exactly that. I sort of snuck off in my lunch break, went to the build office, had a chat with him. And, it was the sudden realization that it was getting quite serious now. And at the time, I guess in his eyes, I was quite an attractive option. I'd built the yacht for 4 years, or I'd certainly insisted to build the yacht for 4 years, so I knew it intimately. I was a fully qualified joiner. I already had a yacht master. I was a helmsman on the lifeboat. I was an RIA powerboat instructor that I used to sort of earn a little bit more money at the weekend with. And I spent most of my childhood messing around on boats. So for him, I was probably quite an attractive option.
Yeah,
and
sure.
It cut a long story short, he offered me a job. I gave my notice to the shipyard, and that was in sort of mid-2008. And we sailed from Falmouth and into the sunset, and that was sort of what kickstarted my career in yachting. So slightly different way of getting in,
so
from the
different.
usual dock walking and on-teeb or utilising crew agents and things. But yeah, I was very fortunate.
And so unusual that your first job, you knew that, but you helped build the boat that you were on.
Yeah.
So you really did start literally from bottom up.
Literally
didn't you?
from the keel up and from the bottom up, exactly. But it was a great boat. It was a great boat. There was a few unusual things on there, like the role with all these weird and wonderful programs. But I think I did 3.5 years on there in the end. We travelled quite extensively, and I eventually left to go and sit my oral, my Officer of the Watch oral.
And then just worked your way. up.
And
3.5 years also is pretty good for a first job as well.
Yeah, it was, but you know, it was traveling pretty extensively, and we had a couple of big tenders on there which I really enjoyed, and I was given a lot of responsibility, you know, and I enjoyed the program. I also happened to meet my now wife, India, on that yacht, so you know, that made life a little bit easier. I mean, we were away for pretty extended periods of time, and sort of back then, any leave that I had, I would always go away and do courses or go back to school. You know, I knew from very early on that this was now going to be a career for me, and I was very focused to sort of progress quickly. And I made that sort of conscious decision to not go home. So for probably 2 or 3 years, I barely went home. You know, I had maybe 25 days leave, and every single second of that leave, I would go and do a course, and I would try and get the next ticket and keep climbing. So, yeah, was it worth it? Absolutely.
Oh yeah, definitely. And also lovely that you met your partner, so that if you weren't going home, you still had that connection with someone.
Yeah. And
that first captain that you had has a lot to answer for, doesn't he?
He was. And I feel like I should mention him, a chap called Bill White. And, you know, he is...
Big up to Bill White.
He is the saltiest of captains that I've probably ever worked with. And I owe my whole career to him, really. He saw something in me, he gave me an opportunity, and he mentored me. And he still sort of mentors and guides me now, you know, nearly 20 years on. He's retired, but I still go to him from advice. You know, he's... I
think also there's a huge thing for anyone in any position, that the person that they answer to either puts trust in them and allows them to progress, or doesn't. And it can really be a career killer if you end up being managed by someone who doesn't put faith in you and allow you to progress. And it sounds like from the very start, he obviously did see something in you, and that's allowed you to become a qualified captain at such a young age, and your career is, you know, progressed from that. So that's amazing.
No,
in the right place at the right time.
Indeed, yeah.
Oh,
very
I
lucky.
love that. That's brilliant. So you're a very successful charter captain. You headed up a well-known charter vessel, and in 2023, Burgess recognised you as Charter Captain of the Year, which is a huge accolade. What would you say are the most important characteristics and or qualities that have allowed you to be such a successful charter captain?
I think first and foremost, you know, I certainly can't take all the credit for that. It's very much the team that surrounds you, and it's the team in the background. You know, for me with a charter, all the hard work is sort of done in the preparation and the lead up to the charter. And then once, you know, you've embarked the guest, it's very much sort of down to the team. But I think the success primarily is building that rapport with charter clients early on. Now that's, I don't mean sort of early on once they're on board, but way before that, you know, once the charter's signed, you know, I always make a point of engaging in conversation with them weeks, sometimes months ahead of time, having video calls, introduce them to the heads of departments on the boat through video. So when they get on board, there's no surprises. You know, find a means of communication that they're comfortable with, whether that's, you know, WhatsApp, text messages, phone calls. For me, it doesn't matter. But it means that when they board, we're already familiar with each other.
Yeah,
we're already on first name terms, you know, or we've agreed prior how they wish to be addressed by the crew, if it's Mr., Mrs., Sir, whatever. But we really try and, you know, tailor their every need. So they embark, they're comfortable, they feel relaxed straight away. And I think finding that balance very early on is key to the future success of that trip.
That's interesting. So for you then, two really key things are finding a great team, which obviously normally is the key to success, but finding the right team for the vessel, and also then making that connection with the charter guests, so that charter really is, from the outset when they sign the paperwork, you get to know that person really, really well. So when they step on board, you're already knowing what they want, how they want the trip to go. So there's no sort of those few days of getting to know each other almost.
Exactly. You know, and it gives you an opportunity to sort of to build that relationship, to preempt their needs. And whether we're communicating with the clients themselves or we're communicating with their assistants, you know, either way, we're getting to know them sort of vicariously, and the difference it makes is huge. I think sort of when I reflect back on all the charters I've done, the ones that have gone really, really well are the ones where we have ample time to to prepare and plan. You know, the ones that have perhaps not gone as well are the people who book quite last minute. You know, they turn up, oh, you're the captain, well, you know, nice to meet you.
Yeah, sure.
And, you know, rather than a familiar face.
Yeah.
So.
What is the best thing and what is the hardest thing about being a super yacht captain?
So the best thing about being a super yacht captain, I think, you know, for me, it's the thrill of responsibility. You know, I still get a buzz from joining the ship. I get a buzz from leaving the ship. You know, completing an ocean passage, or, you know, completing a really challenging docking maneuver. I still get a buzz from this. I get a buzz from when the guest or the owner leaves and says, "Thanks very much, Olly, we had an amazing time." And whilst, again, you know, as I mentioned, it's very much credit to the team. You know, you as the captain are representing the team. You're representing the boat.
You're running the ship, literally, and all the people.
And I take great pride in sort of passing on that thanks to the team. I would say that's probably the best part. And you know, I'm very proud of what I've achieved and sort of proud of what I'm running now. Every time I step off the boat and I look back, you know, I still get those sort of jitters of, wow, this is very cool. You know, is that really my job? And that's exciting. And I think, that's you know, great. I hope I never lose that. Because I think the moment you start to lose that, then, you know, you've got to reconsider, you know, what you're doing. But right now, you know, I'm still hungry for success, and it still excites me, and I still get a buzz from what I do.
That's brilliant. So what about the hardest part?
The hardest.
You can only pick one.
I think the hardest thing for me is probably being away from home. I'm very fortunate and privileged that I am on a rotation. It's not something I take for granted at all. But is it the answer to everything? You know, no, it's not. You know, I still have a family at home. I have young kids. And whilst I get half the year off, I'm still away for half the year. Yeah. And personally, I find that very challenging.
I don't think you're the only one. I think rotation often sounds like this ideal solution, but like we've spoken about recently, it comes with its own challenges.
And, you know, being a captain is a lonely role. You know, and it's finding that balance with the crew of, you know, having a good rapport, having a good, healthy working relationship. But ultimately, you're still the boss of that vessel, you know, and you're accountable for anything and everything that happens on board. So it can be quite lonely, you know, but you've just got to find that very happy sort of medium of not being their best friend, but still being approachable and still enjoying your work, and for them to enjoy their role as well on board.
I mean, if you can't have fun doing what you guys do, then you shouldn't be doing it. Because like you say, for all the sacrifices you make, being away from home, and, you know, the sacrifice of missing things and relationships, it is a crazy, amazing job. So like you say, if you don't still feel that excitement and you're not still enjoying it, then it's not the job, I guess.
No, absolutely.
For you,
and it has to be fun. You know, when I get up in the morning and I walk around the ship and do my rounds, I want to see smiles. You know, I want to see people sort of, you know, engaged in their job, engaged in their role. If they're miserable, then we've got to chat, because they're obviously miserable for a reason. And, you know, they don't want to be miserable. I don't want to see miserable people.
No.
So, you know.
And probably a lot of the feelings that you feel with being away from home and that sort of lifestyle, probably your crew feels. If they see that they can speak to you and you might also feel the same, that's huge sort of comfort to them, the feeling that they can talk and it can be addressed. But also ultimately, if they're not happy, then something needs to be done, because no one wants to be miserable.
That's a really good point. And you know, the yacht I currently work on now, a lot of the senior crew are also in the same position with me. You know, they have rotation, but they also have kids and a young family at home. And whilst they may take comfort in how I cope with it, I also take comfort in how they cope with it. And, you know, we all have our bad days and we chat about it and we work our way through. But it does help. It does help that you're not the only one in that position.
Yeah, of course. And that morale, being able to support each other, is, I imagine, essential.
Enormous. And but, you know, as I said with the rotation, it's not a given. It's not a rite of passage. You know, it's a privilege, and I'm a huge advocate for it for the whole crew. You know, where I can, I'll always fight for the crew to have some sort of rotation. You know, either now or in the near future.
It's definitely becoming more and more common, isn't it? Going down the sort of ranks.
Yeah, and I think it's got to be. Yachting is as professional and as structured as it's ever been, and it's only going in one direction, and it's far more of a recognised professional industry than it was 20 years ago. And that's great. And I think the industry has to follow suit to the merchant world. It's never going to be the same. You can't compare it. But if we can just improve little bit step by step, it can only be a good thing.
Yeah, and improve everyone's sort of balance of life and work if that's possible.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on now to talk about you and the bridge team. What is the most challenging situation that you and your bridge team have found yourself in whilst at sea?
That's a good question. There are lots of challenging situations that we often face, and a lot of them, come out of the blue. We don't plan for these challenges necessarily. I think one that particularly sticks in my mind was, wasn't so much a navigational issue, but it was on a passage from Asia to Holland. I'd just joined a vessel and I was bringing it back to Europe, and we were going through the Gulf of Aden, sort of past the Horn of Africa and up through the Red Sea into the Mediterranean. We'd taken all necessary precautions. We'd embarked 4 armed security personnel. We had drilled extensively, sort of with the crew and with the security guys. But there was an approach of a skiff in the early hours of the morning, and the bridge team woke me, and I came to the bridge. Everything happens very quickly. It doesn't matter how well you rehearse these things, how well you drill. We had a small skiff approach us, sort of looked through the binoculars, a bit blurry-eyed. The sun was just rising, and I could see in the distance that there was a sort of mothership or a dhow. Right. So at that point, you kind of think, oh, it's a little bit unusual. I think we were almost 1,000 miles from land at that point. Gosh. So we were deep sea. I was then communicating with the security guys who were running a 24-hour watch from the upper deck. And everyone was looking at me at that point to sort of make a decision. And I was still sort of blinking, thinking, my God, what time of day is it? Yeah. But we had, the officer to watch at the time. We had, I think, 2 additional lookouts. We had the security guys. And you had to make a split decision. Is this just a fishing boat being inquisitive? Is it a genuine security threat? Truth is, I don't know, and we still won't know now. Yeah, sure. But we made the decision to move things to the next level pretty quickly, and it sort of got to a point where, at that point, all our security team on board were then head to toe in body armor. Their weapons were loaded. The crew were sort of on their way down to the lower deck. We had secured the ship. It was now just me on the bridge. I was in body armor, head to toe. I was sounding the ship's horn. We had put the vessel to full sea speed. And for the sort of team leader to then come forward of the bridge and actually to wave and to raise his weapon to show that we were armed. And it sort of got to a point where he was then looking at me and he was waiting for my go ahead to say, okay, let's put some warning shots in the water. Yeah. And he continued to sort of progress towards the vessel. I think only then to see that we were armed, and this skiff sort of did a big U-turn and off into the distance. So
that'll be a wake-up call that you probably won't ever forget.
it was definitely a wake-up call, and I'd done that passage several times. As a chief officer, and then also as master, and I'd never really had anything that sort of, unusual. Yeah. I say unusual, that sort of close, and
Like you say, I mean, these situations you guys train a lot for, and we talk a lot about, but actually you can't fully train for the real thing because there is no training that puts you in that exact situation. The adrenaline, having to make those decisions. You've got bodies on board that you are responsible for. Yeah. You've got armed security. It's not a normal day-to-day decision to have to make to sort of get in. And also you then fully in armed gear and things. It's all sort of a bit that you think about, but you never really think will happen. No. So I can imagine under that pressure, that's quite scary.
I think there were sort of a few moments there where I was thinking, right, what are we going to do next?
Is this while everyone's looking at you for an answer and you're thinking, oh,
well,
what are we going to do
at this
next?
point? It was just me on the bridge. And it's quite lonely in those sort of circumstances. Yeah. Everyone's down below. You're thinking, right, did they lock that door? Did they put that shore support up? Is that watertight bulkhead closed? And of course it was, because we had drilled so extensively, and it was like clockwork. And we debriefed after it, which I think is key to all these sort of scenarios. A couple of the crew were a little bit shaken, understandably, but was there any malice in it? We don't know.
No.
Will we ever know? Probably not.
No, but I think even if there wasn't, at least it proved that if ever you were in the situation where the threat was increased, how great that you and the team managed it as you did. Oh, I bet you were glad to get to Holland.
It was, it was a long trip.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I think, with those passages where we're effectively entering, a war zone, I do always give the crew the option. I say, listen, are you happy to proceed on this voyage? If you're not, I'll very happily, disembark you here. We'll meet you on the other side. But people, they're normally happy to do these trips, and we take all the necessary precautions. We take, in my opinion, the best security guys in the world. They're all ex-British forces.
But your team see that. I would imagine if you were not a captain who was doing all of those things, probably people wouldn't have the faith to go with you. They'd think, I'll give it a miss and I'll meet you. I'll meet you in Holland.
Probably. But then, the debriefing, the reflection, could we have done anything differently? Could we have done anything better? How did you act? How did you act? And then the the emotional impact that it may have on people.
Yeah.
Whether it's a piracy incident, a fire, a medical incident, it doesn't matter. It's really important to learn from the good things and the bad things. They're human beings we're talking about here. We're not robots. We're people, who've got families at home, and
Yeah, that's interesting.
That's a dirty office.
Yeah, one you're probably quite happy to forget. Okay, well, this moves nicely onto my next question. What's your personal experience of managing crew in a pressurised environment, and how do you keep the crew morale high when you're in an intense charter season? Yeah,
I think, yes, you're the captain, but you're still a crew member. And don't forget that we are all collectively employed by a person or a company, to do a job. And I think it's very important to stay grounded, lose any ego, be approachable. I like to think I operate a very open door policy, to allow crew to talk to me in a professional capacity. So as a friend rather than the captain, so to speak. And I think to have that ability for crew to share their feelings, how they're coping with the stress, how they're coping with the lack of sleep, the turmoil, how they're coping with challenging guests, crew differences. It all happens, and it all highlights itself when people are tired and under pressure. I like to think I can be a medium there to try and diffuse it where I can, help talk, benefit from my experience of me being in these situations.
Yeah, you would have been there yourself going through your career.
Yeah.
So
and
you've got your actual real life experience of probably all the problems that they're going through whilst experiencing.
To utilise, the rest of the crew. There's a vast amount of experience on these huge yachts with the senior crew. Gather their thoughts collectively. Don't just think that you as the captain of the hero you're gonna solve everything, because you're not. You need to really rely on those heads of departments, their experience, their knowledge, bring that into one and see how you can manage these situations and manage the crew. I very heavily rely on heads of departments. I certainly cannot run or manage a large yacht by myself.
Yeah.
You'd burn out in days. Yeah. You really would. And I guess the other thing is, I know it sounds a bit cliche, but lead by example. Do I get out there and scrub decks? No, I don't anymore. But if there's a big provisions run, will I help you? Of course I will. I get down on the swim deck and have a laugh and throw some watermelons on the side deck, and and I think it's important to have a presence there, just so you're not alienated from the crew. You're just not the guy that sits up in the bridge the whole time or sits in his office with his door shutter on the phone. So
you're still part of the team ultimately.
Absolutely.
You? Even if there's a hierarchy that you're at the top of, you're still very much part of what everyone's trying to achieve.
No, for sure. And, there is a hierarchy, and there has to be a hierarchy. But for me, I like to think I will offer the same time of day to the junior deckhand as I will the chief engineer. And that's how I like to operate. And I think it works. I hope it works.
Yeah, that's what I imagine from you. What would you look for in potential crew when trying to recruit for a charter season?
So my sort of stance on crew has changed a little bit over the years. Whilst I'm not against sort of employing young, really green guys for busy charter seasons or busy, private seasons for that matter, you need people with a little bit of life experience. You need people that are going to be able to cope with the long hours and the stress, and the trials and tribulations that come with a busy season. So I think for me, life experience is important. If it was a quieter program, then yeah, great. Bring all the young guys on, because of course I was one once.
Yeah.
And somebody gave me an opportunity. I'm certainly not against it, but you just have to limit your numbers of
I think that's
really
very
young
sensible,
junior
because
crew.
If a young green crew member comes on and you are in the midst of a horrendously busy, pressurised, it might put them off for life. Whereas if they actually, like you said, if you had a quieter program and they could sort of break into the industry by having that experience, also then you have more time to help them, mentor them. Whereas if they're coming in and you are like, you need to hit the ground running, that might, finish them off. So I think that's very sensible. Overwhelming.
So that, and someone that can bring something else to the table. Everyone's got their CCW, everyone's got a medical, everyone's had their basic training. But do you have, are you a barber, for example? Getting a barber on the crew is just the best thing ever.
Yeah.
Have you been a lifeguard? Are you a surfer? Can you kite surf? Are you good at water sports? Are you a good runner?
Yeah.
Are you a good cyclist? Things that we can maybe just kind of drip feed into our itineraries, or something that we can really offer to guests. Are you a good tennis player? I don't know.
Yeah.
But something that, or a crew member that can just offer something a little bit more than the basics. Easier said than done a lot of the time. But I think if you can just try and find someone with something a little bit extra, and that's what I tell to crew now, and friends of friends or kids of friends, and they say, we want to break into the industry. What can we do to give ourselves the best chance? And I said, what other skills have you got to offer?
That's such an interesting way to think about it, because like you say, not anyone, but most people could go and get their qualifications to physically do the job.
Yeah.
But working on a super yacht, there's so much more to it. You're living in a community. So how great if you have an interest that can maybe be your break away from the stress of work. So yoga, tennis, swimming, whatever it is, but also that you can bring to the other people that you're living with, that you can share that with them and enhance the community you're living in. So actually that's such a good point.
It's not just to benefit the guests, it's to benefit your crewmates,
definitely
your second family.
Have you ever had to make a tough call as a captain when faced with a guest request?
Yeah, there are several instances. I think probably one that comes to mind, and I know I'm certainly not going to be the only captain that is often faced with this, but is the pressure from charterers to travel at sea with more than 12 guests. As a commercial yacht, assuming you're not under some passenger yacht code, you are limited to 12 guests on board at any one time as a commercial yacht. Now there is a variation to that, in that you can gain a dispensation or a letter of non-objection from your flag state that will say when you're at anchor or when you're in port, you can have an event for X number of people.
But whilst at sea.
But to travel at sea underway is a different story. And often, you'll be having these events or parties on board where you have more than 12 guests, with the acknowledgement from flag and your insurance company that it's acceptable. And you'll always get the charter guests to push you, can we go to the next anchorage? Or my friend's on a yacht over there, can we go? How many people have you got on board? 16. But absolutely not. Okay, well, a couple can get off. How many now? 30. I was like, I'm really sorry. And I think it happens quite regularly.
Yes.
And I know I'm not going to be the only one, to talk about this, but it can be quite challenging. So I think, that goes back to having a healthy relationship with the charterer, that they understand that as captain, safety is always your priority. It's paramount. And you can build that sort of ethos, and you can build that culture very early on in the trip. And I think that's important. And, even from when they board and you do your safety introduction. And again, I like to introduce the team face to face. I like to be actively involved in the safety demonstration or the sort of safety briefing and the welcome chat on board. And And I quite often slip it in there, that we are permitted to sail with a maximum of 12. So at least it's in their mind.
Yeah.
But they'll still try it sometimes, and why not? Push their luck. But ultimately, they understand that the captain's word is final. And another example is, can we sail overnight? Can we go a day? I said, listen, we can, but it's not going to be particularly enjoyable. Why? Because there's a lot of wind or because there's a bit of a sea running.
Yeah.
My advice will be to delay 12 hours. It's not going to be unsafe if we go now, but this is my recommendation. And often they'll listen to me and we'll sail when I recommend we sail, and they go, wow, that was such a nice trip. Thanks for recommending that. Pleasure. It's my job.
Yeah. Is there a region or an itinerary that will be memorable to you forever, for good or bad reasons?
Yeah, no, for sure. I worked for a couple of Asian owners actually over a period of I don't know, maybe 6 to 8 years. And we spent quite a lot of time in Southeast Asia. We cruised extensively from sort of, Maldives, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, Philippines. We went up to Japan for sort of 6 months.
That sounds incredible.
And it was amazing. It was amazing. And I haven't been back there for a little while, but I would love to go back to that sort of Southeast Asia region. We did a little bit of Western Micronesia. There's a sort of little island group, Palau, that we spent a lot of time in. The diving was world class. We had quite an active crew at the time that really enjoyed scuba diving. We weren't particularly busy, and sort of every opportunity we had, we'd go and scuba dive. Also, I proposed to my wife, which was a bit of fun. So yeah, that sort of region, people say to me all the time, where's the best cruising? And it's probably Southeast Asia. The world's a huge place, and there's lots that I haven't cruised yet. But I say that's the area that sticks in my mind. And if no one ever says, can you give me a suggestion where we'd do some really, really amazing cruising? It would be Southeast Asia for sure. And
you'll remember it forever because obviously you prepared.
Yes. Yeah, it was a fun little story. I chartered a little plane, tiny little plane, one afternoon, and she said, where are we going? I said, we're just going on a sightseeing cruise at the islands. And when we were up there, this little plane had no door and she was petrified the whole time. But it was fun. It was memorable.
She won't ever forget it.
No, she won't. No, it was really fun actually. Whether it was a good move or not, I don't know. But
well, she said yes.
She did.
So
she did. It's either that or I push her out the
I'm sure that's not the case. I'm going to have to interview her and ask her about it now, aren't I? Okay, and then lastly, what or where is on your bucket list that you haven't managed to tick off yet? Which is probably quite a hard question because as a super yacht captain, there's probably lots of places that you would quite like to cruise.
I think two places or two sort of areas come to my mind. One is, I'd love to go to the ice. I've never been to the ice. A lot of yachts now go either to the Arctic or to Antarctica, north or south. I don't mind, but I think it would be a great experience. I know there's a lot of planning involved and a lot of training with the crew, and you need an owner with an adventurous streak, which there are lots of out there now.
More and more, so many more,
And these vessels are so capable, and taking adequate support with you and a chase boat or a support vessel, it's very achievable. So definitely the ice, and also, deepest, darkest Pacific. I've sort of just edged into sort of Western Micronesia, the western side of the Pacific Ocean, but I'd love to cruise, the islands a little bit more and spend a season or a year or whatever, cruising those islands. There's always sort of been a little bit of a romance in the back of my head of how these places look. Yeah. Of course, I've read articles and seen pictures of colleagues that have been there, and it looks amazing. And I'm sure one day I'll get there.
Well, it's good to have something on the bucket list, isn't it?
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. And I think, once you've worked with an owner long enough and, you build up that relationship where you can start to discuss cruising itineraries, I think that's sort of then you can really sort of broaden your horizon with where you can take the ship.
Yeah. I think a lot of owners, we find, tend to have quite regular cruising patterns, and then maybe they have a change of captain, and then suddenly you find that the boat actually becomes quite a bit more adventurous, and maybe they were quite comfortable with the places that they went with the old captain, and maybe the captain was quite comfortable with it, but then the change around means that the new captain sort of brings in new ideas, and once the trust is there, then maybe they feel comfortable to go off and be more adventurous.
Yeah, and I think also, a little bit of education with the owner. They may not know how capable their vessel is.
Yeah, definitely.
The smallest of sail yachts, 25, 30 foot, they sail around the world. Not for me, admittedly, but
not for me either.
But the majority of these large yachts have the capability to go anywhere in the world within reason. But certainly, into the Pacific is very achievable for a lot more yachts than perhaps a yacht owner would think.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much. That was so interesting, and thank you again for giving up your time and coming in and chatting with us.
Good, great to see you.